Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Berrett-Abebe, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk with you about parenting with cancer. And I'm going to be talking about that really from a resiliency framework. So looking forward to sharing some of that information with all of you. As a brief introduction to who I am, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Family Therapy and Social Work at Fairfield University and spent my clinical career in oncology at Mass General Hospital. So let me go ahead and start my presentation. Wonderful. So as I mentioned, what I'm going to be sharing with you really comes out of my clinical work as an oncology social worker at Mass General Hospital. I was embedded in the outpatient breast cancer center there and had the opportunity to work with many families who were coping with cancer. And particularly being at a large academic medical center, I saw a lot of young families who are coping with cancer. So a lot of the information in this presentation really comes from my work with all of them, and I'm grateful to them for letting me share some of their journey. And it also comes from my scholarship and thinking about resiliency in families. So I'm going to be putting that framework around our conversation. So in my conversations with the families I worked with at Mass General Hospital, I would say without fail, parents' number one concern when they met with me, and one of the parents had a new cancer diagnosis, was about how they could best protect their children. And as a parent, I absolutely resonate with that desire that we all want to, as much as we can, protect our children from hardships in life. But as we got further and deeper into conversation, what I realized is that really what we were wanting to do was to give our children these protective factors that they could use throughout their whole life. So our deepest hopes, I think, for our children and our family are that we can give them tools that they can use to deal with adversity that all of us are going to encounter in life. And so one of the things that we can do for our children when they're young is start to role model for them and help them develop both mental framework and also very specific coping strategies. So that really is resiliency. And I'm going to be sharing with you some ideas from two theorists who are Walsh and Van Hook. But this is a quote from Van Hook's book that family resilience is really how a family confronts and manages stress and then moves forward with life. So I think that's really beautifully put. That resiliency is not something that some people are born with and others are not, but it's really something that is developed and built over time. And very often as a family, when we have to deal with new adversity or there's some kind of shifting context in our world, we have to develop new strategies to better cope with that and enhance our resiliency at that period of time. So given the complex interplay between families, individuals within families, and then the context that all of us are constantly dealing with, I just want to reiterate that you are the expert on your own family. So as you're watching this presentation, I hope that there are aspects of it that feel helpful to you and really feel like they could support you and your family as you're building resiliency. And then there might be concepts that don't resonate quite as much, and that is absolutely fine. And then as I'm getting started, I want to give a quick thank you to Dr. Paula Rausch and the PACT program at Mass General. So that stands for Parenting at a Challenging Time. And they're a really wonderful consultation program out of the psychiatry department at Mass General. And they're really influential in my work. And I collaborated a lot with them. So some of these ideas I'll reference for you came out of that work as well. So sorry, I'm going to go back one slide. So as we're talking sort of at a really basic level about building resiliency, I want to give this framework about families. And when I'm talking about families, families obviously look really differently and have very different configurations. So you may be in a family where there are two parents and children. You may be in a single parent household. You may be in a family in which your family is maybe not blood relations, but are individuals that you've chosen to share your life with and offer support to one another. Regardless of how we define family, we know that family plays a critical role in providing both risk and protective factors to individual members. And so what we're going to talk about today is how we can enhance those protective factors. We know particularly when we're talking about children that the most important protective factor for children is the presence of caring and stable adults in their life. And we know that that's for many reasons. So, adults can help children form a sense of identity. They provide safety, nourishment, both physically and emotionally. And they can really set the stage for how children understand life events and then how they understand the resources that might be available to them to help cope with life events. They help buffer stress. And so as I'm saying this, I know as a parent, I'd be thinking, oh man, that sounds like a really important job. Am I doing a good enough job? And that's exactly the right word, I think, is good enough. None of us have to be perfect as parents, but there's this idea that was popularized by a theorist named Winnicott about being a good enough parent. And it just means doing your best. And if you're doing your best most of the time, then you're doing it well enough. So we all want to be able to try to offer that to our children. And I think too, we want to not underestimate that presence is really important. So I think sometimes as parents, when we become ill and we might not be able to do some of the practical tasks that we typically might do for our kids, so maybe we're no longer able to help with homework or coach Little League, or there's a possibility that maybe we can't even make it into school for parent-teacher conferences. We might get down on ourselves about that. I think what some of this literature really highlights is the importance just of presence. That the most important thing is that we are in our children's lives and we are there for them, particularly emotionally. I think it's also important to realize that there can be many caring adults in a child's life, and that often with cancer, there are shifting family roles. So, for example, it might be that mom used to be the one to make breakfast and drive the kids to school, and now that's not possible because of cancer treatments. Perhaps grandparents are stepping in or an aunt is stepping in, and maybe there's a sleepover that happens the night of chemotherapy for mom, and then another really caring, important adult in a child's life is able to drive them to school instead. So we know that caring, stable adult presence is important, but it can look really differently. It doesn't have to look the same all the time. And I think the other thing that's important is making sure that with this interplay between individuals and family well-being, that as parents, we take care of ourselves. So this is a way to role model for our kids that it's important to care for ourselves, but it's important also if we're going to be there in our children's lives and be stable and present, that we need to fill our own wells, so to speak, so that we take time for ourselves as well. So a couple of tips. One is to protect family time. So I think this becomes harder and harder to do when you're getting a lot of phone calls from doctors' offices or from friends or, a well-meaning community. So it might be that you decide that during dinner time, it's a phone-free zone and you put your cell phones in a basket, and everybody has to do that, even the teenagers, and you get to spend some time together. Or you decide you are going to take a family walk after dinner every night, or once a week is going to be family game night. Maybe on the night that dad feels the best during treatments, you're going to focus on a family game night. So definitely prioritize and protect family time, even with a lot of competing demands. And then the other is, the old adage, it takes a village to raise children. It absolutely does, but you don't have to communicate with all of them at once. So speaking of protecting family time, it really is okay to maybe have a point person be the one to communicate with your social support network. I'll give some additional tips about this when we're talking about social support, but knowing that you can rely on other caring adults is important. So we started to talk about this a little bit in the last slide, but I want to talk about organizational patterns of family. So we were talking about this, how having stable, caring adults was important for children, and it is. But particularly when families are going through a period of crisis or adjustment or adversity, it's important to strive for both stability and flexibility. So sort of similar to what I was saying previously in terms of, having the same routine for kids, that somebody makes them breakfast and packs their lunch and maybe drops them off at school, that same routine might be conducted or carried out by multiple people. And that's the flexibility part. So we know that routines are important for children. Gives them a sense of safety, control, knowing what's going to come next. So we know that that's important. And then the flexibility piece comes in terms of, multiple hands or people being involved in making the routine work when maybe a parent is not able to do so. So the other thing about flexibility and stability is that in order to create stability and flexibility, maybe you create new traditions. And new traditions are really easy to enact. So all you have to do is say, instead of making omelets on Saturday, our new family tradition is that we go out and buy bagels. Maybe that's a little less time consuming than having to cook on the weekend, and particularly when someone's not feeling well, that seems appealing. And after a week, that's the new family tradition. So traditions offer a lot of stability, but it doesn't mean that all traditions have to stay stable over time. You can introduce new ones. Another important role that families can play is figuring out what resources they need in the community and tapping into those. So tapping into social support when a parent is sick is incredibly important. There are so many different ways in which families need help. And it can be everything from financial help to emotional support to practical support, like we were talking about, driving kids to school or maybe bringing over meals. And demonstrating to kids that you know what your resources are and how you can tap into them in an effective way is a way to build resiliency. It's an important thing to teach kids. It doesn't mean that everybody has to tap into the same resources or do it the same way. So, some families certainly have chosen, that I've worked with, have chosen to tell or disclose to more people than others about a cancer diagnosis. Some have said, I'm just telling a few friends from church, and they're organizing something a little bit more anonymously for me. Whereas other people have said to me, it really helps me to talk. I actually tell the cashier when I check out at the grocery store. And believe it or not, the cashier offered me some support. So that's absolutely a valid choice. Every family can make their own choice about how much to disclose, but tapping into social support is helpful. A tip is to be specific about what your family needs. So for some families, meals are incredibly helpful. This takes away a lot of the stress, particularly at the end of the day, maybe when a parent is tired. But for other families, they might have a lot of special needs in terms of diet, and meals are not helpful or important. So, it might be rides that are more important or play dates that are more important for kids. I gave an example on this slide of a website that can be helpful in terms of helping to organize social support. So this one's called Lots of Helping Hands, but there are other similar sites. And essentially you can go in and customize what you need done on what day, and then people can sign in. Your community, if they get an invitation, can sign in under their email address and sign up to do things, and the system will send them reminders. So it could be, my car needs an inspection sticker, could somebody take it? I would love it if somebody could host a tennis play date for my son. There's a variety of different ways in which you can use this. And you could, as we were talking about in the last slide, appoint a point person. So you don't actually have to manage the system yourself. That might be a way that you tap into social support. So some other important things to talk about. So when we think about family resiliency, regardless of family configuration or the age and stage, whether you have young kids or school-age kids or adolescents or young adults, communication is incredibly important. And there are different ways that we can think about communication. So communication really facilitates and builds trust amongst a family. And it can help develop a sense of cohesion among family, make sure everybody is on the same page and feels like they're part of a family sharing information. That doesn't mean that everybody has to get all the same information. So, if you have young children, you might not share as much with them about specific treatments or side effects or prognoses about cancer than if you have older children. But you still might explain information in a really clear, easy to understand way. So one tip, and the tips on this page really come from my work with the PACT program, is to always use the word cancer and to share information in really clear, accurate, even if it's simple, language. So the rationale behind this is to not use euphemisms, things like, oh, mommy has a boo-boo, or, not feeling well, that kind of thing, because those are easy for kids to conflate and kind of identify with themselves, and can potentially cause more worry. So using specific language can be really helpful, and simple explanations like cancer is when cells start to grow too fast in your body and form something called tumors might be an example of a way to describe cancer in simple language. So there's the clarity of communication. And then there is accepting a range of emotions and emotional expression, even when they might be different across family members. So, one person might be feeling really sad, whereas another person might feel angry and be expressing that a family can tolerate that kind of expression. Certainly our culture, both thinking about our culture more broadly as well as our smaller family culture, influences how we express emotion. So, in some families, there might be lots of loud talking and lots of gestures and a lot of crying or laughing, loud emotions. And in another family, there might be much more muted emotional expression, and that's the norm within the family. All of that is normal. There is no particular norm that families need to strive for in terms of emotional expression. What is desired is welcoming a range of emotions and expressions and welcoming questions. So I think sometimes questions can feel sort of scary, opening up questions about cancer from children, because parents are unsure about what kinds of questions might come up. So, a question I remember a parent asking me about was, what if my child says, who will take care of me if you can't? I'm not sure how to answer that question. So there's a few different tips I would have. So one would be to try to get underneath the question. So to ask, gee, what got you thinking about that question? And you might learn that really the worry was more about thinking about a family vacation and will we still get to go on vacation? So sometimes it's very concrete things that you can actually answer more easily. Or it might be okay to defer and to say, I think that's a really important question and I need to talk more to, and depending on the question, you might name a medical provider, you might name a trusted friend, you might name a family member, and then I will get back to you with more information. So that would be another way to answer the question, and do make sure you get back to kids. And then another thing might be thinking about the third thing on our list, which is collaborative problem solving. So you might invite a child into answering the question. So you might say something like, that's a really great question. What do you think? Who would you want to take care of you if I couldn't? And you might be able to, build together sort of like a plan that a child might feel comfortable with. Another tip from the PAC team that I think is important to mention is that the worst way to learn about troubling information is to overhear it. So I know a lot of times initially when families or parents are going through a workup for a cancer diagnosis, they might not be telling people yet. Or they might be talking to a trusted friend about how to share information before they share information with a child. Just to really bear in mind that sharing information is important in terms of this idea of building resiliency, but also because it can be really scary for kids if there are secrets. And very often when information is overheard, I think the impulse is to feel like the information is scarier than it actually is because it's hidden. So those are just a few things to think about. So I want to build upon this idea of collaborative problem solving and the ways in which families can support one another. And I want to do that by thinking about this relational perspective. So again, this idea comes from Walsh, who's thought a lot about family resiliency. So the relational perspective says that as a family, we face problems and we tackle them together. So it's not, cancer is not an I problem, it's a we problem. And the reasoning behind this is that it really promotes family cohesiveness, it promotes closeness, and it promotes trust within a family. But I also think it has really specific benefits for children. So the first is that it can really help kids develop a sense of self-efficacy, which just means that they have confidence in their ability to solve problems and to effectively and sometimes independently solve problems. So again, this collaborative problem-solving model, if we're approaching things from a we perspective, we might say, mom is a single mom, and I know the day after chemo, I start to feel pretty sick, and it's hard for me to make breakfast. Do you have any ideas? I might be asking a school-age child about that. What could we do? Maybe a child comes up with the idea that if they leave out the cereal in a bowl the night before and make sure everything's arranged, that they could get cereal together for themselves and their younger sibling. And the child comes up with this idea on their own. So not only does the process of coming up with the idea promote a feeling of self-efficacy, but then being able to follow through on that idea promotes feelings of confidence for kids. This relational perspective also talks about the balance between autonomy and connectedness. So people being able within a family to feel independent and like they can have their own unique thoughts and actions and plans, and then feeling connected to one another. So I used the example earlier in terms of social support about maybe different family members, or I should say different people having different comfort levels in terms of how much information to disclose or share about a cancer diagnosis. That might happen within an individual family. So it might be that, one family member, perhaps the family member who has a cancer diagnosis, let's say it's dad, really wants to share information with a lot of people and feels like it's very helpful that everybody at work and everybody at the golf club and everybody that he interacts with socially knows what he's coping with in terms of the cancer and finds that very helpful. It might be that dad has a teenage daughter who really does not want to share very much information. And so there might be a negotiation that happens within the family about, okay, dad shares the information as he sees fit, but maybe at the daughter's school, the information isn't shared broadly. It's just shared with the people that need to know. So maybe it's the administrator and the teacher, and then the daughter's able to just share with one close friend or two. And so in that way, different family members' preferences and autonomy can be honored. And then the other thing in terms of thinking about this relational perspective is thinking a little bit about a developmental perspective for families and how the needs of families and their family members really shift at different points in a family's life cycle. So the needs of a family with young children, as I'm sure you all know, are very different from the needs of a family with adolescents. And so we might need to learn different coping strategies to manage the family needs at those various times. So one group I want to pay some attention to as an example and think about how a parent's cancer might impact them are teenagers. And I use this example because adolescence is a time within a developmental perspective in which children are trying to negotiate this idea of how to stay connected to the family while also gaining greater independence from the family. And so what can sometimes happen during cancer is that can get complicated. Because maybe children or teenagers, I should say, want to support mom or dad more than they typically would have felt normally. And so maybe they want to help out a little bit more at home. Maybe they want to do a little more babysitting for younger siblings. Maybe if they have a driver's license, they want to be the ones to drive mom or dad to treatment and maybe sit with them, pick up a medication for them, that kind of thing. And so, we think about how we might honor a teen's desire to be more involved, given their greater level of independence in a parent's cancer diagnosis, while also still setting some limits for teens and encouraging them to be able to explore their interests outside of the family. So It might still be very important for parents to be firm with teens about, for example, a family curfew. It might also be very important to be firm with teens about going out, that we want to still encourage them to spend time with friends, to keep their part-time job, and to continue to develop a sense of independence, even as a parent is managing a cancer diagnosis. So just one example of how a developmental perspective can be helpful in thinking about parenting with cancer. And then one other area I wanted to talk a little bit about in terms of building resiliency is how families can really tap into belief systems, values, and ways of making meaning that are important to them. And again, this might be very unique for different families, but I think dealing with adversity in life is often a time when we can impart to our children some of the values that are most important to us and that have most aided us in coping as parents throughout our lifetime. And so, some examples of values that we might think are important and want to impart are things like trust and hope and kindness and empathy. And one example that I give here is a children's book that articulates some of those values. So this one's called Emmanuel's Dreams. And you can see it's a story of a boy who had a leg amputation. And so there are lots of children's books like this that we might be able to use as parents as ways to start to help children think about values, to impart some of our values, and to help our children think about how they can incorporate those values into their life and their specific life circumstance. I often would work with families around building their own narratives. So the way we think about our own life story is really important. And it helps give us a roadmap for, where we've been, where we are, and where we want to go in life. And it helps connect what's happening to us in any given time or moment to just a larger story. So we can use stories to build stories, so we can develop our own family narrative. And I also wanted to say a word just about people's religious or transcendent or cultural beliefs and how they can be incredibly helpful in terms of coping with hard times. So I had one family in particular that I remember, and because of their religious beliefs, the rainbow was a really important symbol to them, and it really symbolized hope. And they would tell me stories about how, as a family, they would be driving places, and they had a mom who was in treatment for many, many years due to cancer. And they would travel, they would take road trips together, and they would invariably end up seeing rainbows on their road trips. And sometimes this would happen in the midst of some difficult conversations that they were having as families. And it would give them pause to stop and really remember that value or belief and hope that they had as a family. And in fact, Mom would often bring in little symbols or statues or cards with her when she was receiving treatment. And I remember her bringing a little beautiful rainbow charm that she would hang by the window. Another tip that I wanted to suggest is the importance of laughter and humor. So I think for all of us, levity is so important. And it's another really important way that people build resilience is to be able to sometimes see the lighter side of things and be able to laugh together. It can really if people are having conflict in a family, it can be a part of conflict resolution skills in addition to other important things like really being able to listen and try to understand one another from their perspective. And, speaking of laughter, I think it can be really helpful to articulate for our kids what are some of the coping strategies that work for us when we're going through hard things, and then helping kids develop their own list. So, watching a funny movie might be at the top of your list, or it might be calling a close friend or going to a yoga class, taking a run. There might be there's a million different iterations of this because so many people have different coping strategies that work for them. And then encouraging kids to develop their own strategies. So I just want to end with some information about some additional resources. So as you're coping with cancer as a parent, I I think it's very normal to feel uncertain and worried and sometimes sad. And if those feelings are prolonged and continue over time or deepen, I would really encourage people to reach out to resources that are available through cancer centers. So oncology social workers, which was my role at the hospital, are embedded in treatment teams and really there as the emotional support providers and counselors on the team. There are also psychologists who play similar roles, as well as oncology specific chaplains, or maybe you have a clergy person or a pastor in your life that you would reach out to outside of a hospital setting. There are also lots of wonderful support groups and peer mentoring groups, some specific to parents coping with cancer and some more general or specific to different kinds of cancer. And I know Survivorship Journeys has some of those programs available. And then I wanted to share a couple of links for you where you could go for additional information or resources. So as I mentioned, the Mass General PACT program was a program I worked closely with. They have several helpful publications. The one I have here, the hyperlink to, is a online publication that's kind of a toolkit for parents. I find it incredibly helpful, but also this will link you to their website, and they have other publications there as well. And then there are a couple of websites that I found that folks have found helpful. So parentingwithcancer.com, and then there's a nice article on cancer.net, which is an ASCO related website about coping with cancer and particularly families parenting with cancer. So I also wanted to make sure that you have the references that I referenced and used throughout my slides. So those are Van Hook and Walsh, Thinking About Family Resilience. I hope this was a helpful framework for you and your family as you're thinking about parenting with cancer. And I wish you all the best as you move forward, and look forward to hopefully having some comments and interactions with people about the content of this presentation. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen.